Welcome back to Reformed Thinking, the place where we take complex source material, slice it up, and deliver the essential insights you need to be informed quickly and clearly. Today, we are undertaking a focused deep dive into a text that, while often overlooked, is the essential key to understanding one of the 20th century's most significant theological works.
Yeah.
The preface to C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity.
It's so true. The preface isn't just an introduction. It's Lewis laying out his entire blueprint for apologetics, for communication strategy, and for Christian unity.
Right.
For you, the listener, our mission is to quickly grasp Lewis's precise methodology and his strategic limitations. We need to zero in on why he so carefully avoided denominational specifics and how he mounted the surprisingly vigorous defense of keeping the word Christian defined objectively.
It really is the operating manual for the whole book, isn't it? We're pulling directly from Lewis's own explanation of what he was trying to do, his methods, and the scope of his project.
And this material is fantastic. It gives you the book's origin story, how it went from being wartime BBC radio talks to a collected volume. It shows the editorial corrections Lewis had to make later on.
And we're going to pay special attention to two incredible analogies he uses.
Yes. First, the analogy of the gentleman, which is Lewis's logical defense for keeping an objective definition of Christianity and why spiritualizing language can just ruin communication.
Then the famous one.
The hall and rooms analogy. It perfectly defines the boundaries between the central common core of the faith and the specific necessary Christian communions, explaining both unity and the personal requirement to make a choice.
Okay, so let's unpack this by starting at the beginning. The origins.
Yeah.
The way Lewis first delivered this content on the airwaves as BBC radio talks during World War II, that's crucial because it dictated the entire original style of the printed book.
That wartime context is so often understated. Lewis was broadcasting to a nation under existential stress, looking for spiritual clarity, grappling with these huge moral questions. The medium itself, the radio talk, it demanded intimacy and immediacy.
And the material we now read as Mere Christianity didn't just appear as one book at first. It was serialized, published in 3 separate parts that collected those broadcasts.
That's right. You had The Case for Christianity in 1943, which was known as Broadcast Talks in England, then Christian Behavior, also in 43, and finally, Beyond Personality in 1945.
Even the titles themselves suggest a logical progression. You move from the rational case for belief to what that belief requires in your behavior, and then finally to the nature of God himself.
And that broadcast origin, as you said, led directly to what Lewis later called the conversational hybrid. He knew that for radio to work, especially for skeptical listeners, the talk had to sound as real talk as possible.
He wanted to avoid that stilted formal tone of just reading an essay over the air.
Absolutely. And to sound like real talk, he had to use relaxed language. He says he used all the contractions and colloquialisms he normally would, so don't instead of do not.
Leave for we have.
Exactly. And when those talks were first transcribed and printed, they kept that conversational style. But he carried over one specific device from speaking into print that he later saw as a problem: vocal emphasis.
This is where it gets really interesting, because the communication technique just failed the translation test. When Lewis was speaking on the radio, he'd naturally use his voice tone, volume, pace to hit the key concepts.
And when the script was first printed, they tried to reproduce that vocal emphasis by just using italics for those key words.
It's a fascinating look into the challenges of moving from one medium to another. Lewis later looked at that initial style for the combined edition and found it was lacking. He called it an undesirable hybrid between the art of speaking and the art of writing.
It wasn't fully conversational, but it also wasn't fully polished written prose.
So why did he think it was so undesirable? Well, he realized that each medium has its own rules for emphasis. A speaker obviously relies on sound and timing, but a writer, he concluded, has his own different means of bringing out the key words.
The tools of prose are structural things like syntax, word choice, careful rhythm, where you place a word in a paragraph. Relying on italics, Lewis felt, was just a clumsy substitute for good writing. It was a sign of a transcription that hadn't been fully edited into a proper book.
So this led to the big editorial correction in the later editions, which is the text most of us read today. Lewis went through and meticulously revised it, expanding all those contractions went back to do not.
And significantly, he got rid of most of those distracting italics by recasting the sentences completely. He'd adjust the structure and vocabulary to make sure the familiar tone was still there, but he achieved it through proper literary techniques, not just transcription tricks.
It's a great lesson in respecting the medium. You can be approachable without compromising literary discipline. But it went beyond just style, didn't it? He also used this chance to update the content.
Absolutely. The revision wasn't just cosmetic. Lewis was honest enough to know that he'd matured in his understanding in the decade between the broadcasts and the compiled book. He says he added and deleted content where he felt he understood the subject better, or where the original version had been misunderstood.
He wasn't afraid to admit his first explanations could be improved. That willingness to correct his own work based on experience, that speaks volumes about his humility as a communicator.
So, having made that shift from airwaves to pages, we get to Lewis's core logical constraint, defining the scope of his project. He defined mere Christianity as the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. It's the irreducible minimum, an agreed or common or central Christianity.
It's a very deliberately narrow focus. He wanted to make sure listeners understood his personal context right away. He said he was just a very ordinary layman of the Church of England. He wasn't a bishop, not a professional theologian, not a denominational authority.
Right. He described his own position as neither especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else. This is Lewis basically stating his qualifications, or lack thereof, to speak on these internal, controversial matters. His authority came from his lay perspective and his ability to communicate the common core.
And this is essential. He explicitly said this work was not some kind of stealth mission to convert people to his specific Anglican position. Mere Christianity wasn't an alternative creed or a new church.
You couldn't just join the Church of Mere Christianity instead of, say, being a Presbyterian or a Catholic. It was the common ground, the starting line, not the final destination.
That restriction really begs the question, though. Why did Lewis, who had such a sharp theological mind, choose to limit himself to the core and ignore all the rich traditions and specific doctrines he held as an Anglican?
Well, he gives us 4 really compelling, interconnected reasons.
The first one is just practical service. His primary motivation was evangelistic and outward-facing. He wanted to explain and defend the core Christian faith to his unbelieving neighbors. He wasn't writing for clergy or for academic debate. He was writing for the person on the street who knew nothing about Christianity.
So providing that common foundation was the highest service he felt he could offer that specific audience.
And the second reason.
The second relates to his expertise limit. And this really speaks to his intellectual honesty. Lewis said that the questions that divide Christians, things like church structure, sacraments, salvation, often get into high theology or even of ecclesiastical history.
And he knew those fields require real experts. He admitted openly that he would be out of my depth in such waters.
Exactly. So he was avoiding deep dives into specific theories of the Atonement, for example. The arguments over penal substitution versus Christus Victor, or debates over grace and works. Those are vital topics. But Lewis knew that to address them meant leaving the common ground and leaving his lane as a lay apologist.
The third reason is purely about strategic evangelism. This is critical for anyone in outreach. Lewis believed that discussing disputed points, the things that separate Christians, has no tendency at all to bring an outsider into the Christian fold.
In fact, he thought dwelling on internal disagreements is much more likely to deter him from entering any Christian communion.
That's a sharp insight. An outsider doesn't look at a debate between a Methodist and a Presbyterian and think, wow, I should join one of them. They think, if these guys can't agree on the basics, why should I commit to any of it?
Right. Lewis's rule was strict. Internal division should only be discussed among those who already agree on the foundational belief in one God and Jesus Christ. You have to get the person in the hall before you discuss which room is best.
And the fourth reason was based on a gap in the market, so to speak.
Yes, Lewis wasn't interested in controversy for its own sake. He saw that many talented authors were already writing about controversial matters. That meant the defense of mere Christianity, the common core, was actually the thinnest part of the literary line. He chose to reinforce the weakest part of the intellectual defense.
Now, we have to address the big critique Lewis saw coming, that by setting aside all the disputed points, he'd only be left with a vague and bloodless HCF, a highest common factor that's just bland and theologically useless.
And this is where Lewis's argument becomes, to use his own word, truly pungent. He countered that skeptical view directly. He argued that this common ground is something not only positive, but pungent.
So what makes it pungent? It's not just a collection of nice ethical ideas. Lewis makes sure this core includes the absolute moral law, a personal God who acts in history, the doctrine of the Trinity, however simply he presents it, and a historical reality of Jesus Christ as fully God and fully man, and the resurrection. These are not vague points.
Not at all. These core beliefs are separated from all non-Christian beliefs by a chasm to which the worst divisions inside Christendom are not really comparable at all. The difference between a Christian who believes in the Trinity and the resurrection and an atheist or a deist or a Buddhist is dramatically larger than the difference between a Baptist and an Orthodox believer.
So it shifts the focus from secondary doctrinal battles to the primary war for metaphysical truth. But Lewis still had to make sure he didn't accidentally sneak in some peculiar Anglican doctrine.
Right. He needed some intellectual accountability, so he undertook this rigorous vetting process. To make sure his claims were genuinely common, he took the original script of what became Book 2, the Central Theological Claims, and sent it to 4 respected clergymen outside his tradition for criticism.
The 4 vetting experts were an Anglican, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, and a Roman Catholic. A pretty good spread across the ecclesiastical spectrum.
And their feedback gives us incredible insight into where that common ground really was. The criticisms were precise and, in the grand scheme, pretty minor. The Methodist clergymen felt Lewis should have said more about faith, which makes sense given the emphasis in Wesleyan theology.
And the Roman Catholic clergymen, on the other hand, felt Lewis went rather too far about the comparative unimportance of theories in explanation of the atonement. Lewis had tried to keep the atonement simple, focusing on the fact of Christ's sacrifice, not the mechanism.
And the Catholic reviewer felt that minimizing the theories, even if he didn't mean to, risked downplaying the essential work of Christ. But despite these small, predictable quibbles, Lewis reported, all 5 of us were agreed on the main content. This process confirmed Lewis had achieved his goal of presenting an agreed or common or central or mere Christianity.
Okay, so having established the scope, Lewis then had to defend the definition of his core subject, the word Christian. This leads us into one of the most intellectually compelling parts of the preface, challenging this idea that we can just subjectively define our terms based on a spiritual feeling.
Yes, he was facing objections from people who wanted to spiritualize the word Christian. They'd argue that someone who struggles to believe the doctrines but lives the life of selfless sacrifice might be far more truly a Christian, far closer to the spirit of Christ, than someone who accepts the doctrine but behaves poorly.
It's an objection that has, as Lewis admitted, every amiable quality. It sounds charitable, it sounds sensitive, it feels morally right. But Lewis just cuts through the feeling and argues it's not useful for communication.
He argues that if you want words to actually convey facts and information, you can't define them based on subjective criteria or inner, invisible character traits. And to illustrate this linguistic danger, he introduces the now famous gentleman analogy.
Let's break that down, because it's a perfect example of how linguistic utility can be destroyed by well-meaning sentiment. Originally, gentleman had a factual, objective description. It meant one who had a coat of arms and some landed property.
And crucially, Lewis points out, this was not a compliment, it was purely informational, a statement of status. You could factually be a liar and a gentleman, just like you could be a fool and an M.A. The word described a social position, not a moral character.
Then came the slow, creeping shift. People started emphasizing that noble behavior, being honorable, courteous, was more admirable than just owning property. They argued the true gentleman behaved rightly, regardless of his status.
Their intentions were good, they wanted to praise virtue, but the consequence of that shift was a disaster for the word's utility. Gentleman stopped being a descriptive label and became purely a term of praise.
So when you call someone a gentleman in this new sense, you're not giving objective information anymore. You're just stating your personal positive attitude toward him.
It becomes like saying a meal is nice. Lewis points out that a nice meal just means a meal the speaker likes. Once gentleman was spiritualized and refined out of its old, coarse, objective sense, it ended up meaning hardly more than a man whom the speaker likes.
And the result, gentleman, became a useless word. Why? Because we already have words for approval like good, kind, or honorable. We didn't need a new word for praise, but by hijacking gentleman, we spoiled it for its original purpose.
This analogy is just brilliant, and Lewis immediately applies the exact same warning to the word Christian. If the word is spiritualized and refined, based on our subjective assessment of someone's behavior, Lewis warns it will speedily become a useless word.
And he gives 2 reasons why neither Christians nor unbelievers can use this refined sense.
First, he says Christians themselves can't judge. We are forbidden to judge and do not see into men's hearts. Applying the word based on some inner spiritual closeness would be wicked arrogance, and it's impossible to verify.
And what about the unbeliever?
Well, the unbeliever can't use it either. If they use Christian in the refined sense, they're just using it as a synonym for good man, which again doesn't enrich the language. We already have the word good. It spoils the word Christian for any really useful purpose it might have served.
So Lewis insists on the original obvious meaning, rooted in historical fact. He grounds his definition in Acts 11, verse 26, where the name Christians was first given at Antioch to the disciples, to those who accepted the teaching of the apostles.
It's a purely objective and propositional definition. A Christian is someone who assents to the central apostolic doctrines.
I have to push back a bit here, though. Doesn't this objective, almost harsh standard sacrifice the charity Lewis himself champions elsewhere? How does he defend choosing utility over what feels like kindness?
He addresses this by arguing that clarity is a form of kindness in communication. The objective standard is purely pragmatic. The point isn't a theological one about who is truly saved in God's eyes. It's simply a question of using words so that we can all understand what is being said.
So if we stick to the objective standard, we can preserve a crucial distinction. We can call a person who accepts the doctrine but lives poorly a bad Christian.
Precisely. If we spiritualize the term, that distinction just disappears. You can't be a bad Christian if Christian already means good person. This linguistic clarity allows Lewis to discuss doctrine and behavior separately, instead of just saying he is not a Christian because his behavior is faulty. That distinction is necessary for correction and repentance inside the church.
Okay, so if the gentleman analogy secured the objective definition of who Lewis was talking to, the hall and rooms analogy secures the scope of what he was talking about, the relationship between the core faith and the need for a denominational choice.
This analogy is maybe the most quoted part of the preface because it brilliantly manages that tension between Christian unity and specific church practice. Lewis used it to clarify the relationship between mere Christianity, the content of his book, and the various specific communions.
The hall is mere Christianity, the shared common doctrines. It's the architectural space of universal assent. Lewis explains that the entire purpose of his book was simply to bring someone into this hall. That's the first step.
It's the point of entry, the threshold. But Lewis immediately introduces the crucial constraint. The hall is a place to wait and try doors, not a place to live in. This is the central directive of the analogy.
So why can't you live in the hall?
Because the actual, tangible corporate Christian life, the living, breathing reality of discipleship, is found exclusively in the rooms. Lewis says the rooms have fires and chairs and meals. The hall is cold, empty, and non-committal.
It's a very compelling contrast. The fire is the warmth of worship and fellowship. The chairs are the established structures and discipline. And the meals are the sacraments and corporate nourishment.
And those things are specific. They require form and commitment, and they cannot be found in the vague, uncommitted center.
Lewis makes the point dramatically. The worst of the rooms, whichever that may be, is, I think, preferable to staying in the hall indefinitely. That is a powerful statement against the modern trend of being spiritual but not religious. Lewis insists that just intellectually agreeing with the core faith is not enough for actual Christian living. You have to choose a room.
This immediately brings up the question, what about people who struggle to choose? Lewis is pastoral here. He acknowledges that some people might have to wait in the hall for a while, maybe praying and studying before making a choice. But he frames this waiting not as indecision, but as providence.
He assures listeners that God keeps no one waiting unless he sees that it is good for him to wait. It's an act of patient guidance. But even while you're waiting, Lewis sets conditions. You have to keep praying for light, and crucially, even in the hall, you must begin trying to obey the rules which are common to the whole house.
So even in the waiting period, you're not passive. You are actively living out the ethical and theological common ground prayer, common morality that Lewis laid out. The hall is for preparation, not relaxation.
This leads directly to the criteria for choosing a room for choosing a denomination. Lewis gives definitive guidance, and he warns against letting the choice be based on personal preference or taste, which he sees as spiritually lazy.
The choice can't be consumerist. The questions, Lewis stresses, should never be, do I like that kind of service? Or judging a room by the paint and paneling. That's judging by aesthetics or comfort.
Instead, you have to ask these searching, conscience-driven questions. Are these doctrines true? Is holiness here? Does my conscience move me towards this? Is my reluctance to knock at this door due to my pride or my mere taste or my personal dislike of this particular doorkeeper?
Notice the progression there. Truth, holiness, conscience, and then finally self-examination about your own barriers, like pride or personal antipathy. The choice has to be theological, moral, and self-critical. It's rooted in conviction, not convenience.
And finally, once the choice is made and you're in your room, the universal rules of the house still apply. Lewis emphasizes charity. Be kind to those who have chosen different doors and to those who are still in the hall.
And that kindness isn't passive. He adds that if they are wrong in their choice, they need your prayers all the more. And if they are your enemies, a fellow believer you strongly disagree with, you are under orders to pray for them. The common moral law of Christianity supersedes all the internal disagreements. The whole rules apply even in the rooms.
So Lewis's commitment to mere Christianity meant he had to be silent on many issues he had clear opinions on. He makes it plain that his silence doesn't mean he was sitting on the fence. He avoided these topics strategically because he was writing about common Christianity, not my religion.
These omissions were precise choices, designed to avoid topics that would immediately lead into highly controversial regions and just wreck a book about mere Christianity for the outsider who wasn't even convinced of the core claims yet.
A prime example of avoiding these doctrinal landmines is the issue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Lewis knew that saying anything more than what's required by the doctrine of the virgin birth would immediately plunge the whole discussion into controversy.
He actually spends time explaining why this issue is so sensitive on both sides. On one hand, for Roman Catholics, this involves a peculiar and, as it were, chivalrous sensibility, a profound devotion and reverence for the Mother of God, which makes any perceived slight feel like a personal insult to their faith.
And on the other hand, the opposed Protestant position, especially among radical Protestants, is just as intense. It's driven by a fear that goes down to the very roots of monotheism. Their concern is that devotion to Mary imperils the absolute distinction between creator and creature.
They fear blurring that line, seeing a potential for idolatry. Lewis knew that for an outsider, his unbelieving neighbor reading about this massive, emotionally charged conflict would be completely counterproductive. He felt it made for utterly unprofitable reading, for anyone not yet convinced that the Virgin Son is God in the first place.
That decision just shows the magnitude of the conflicts he was navigating. He was protecting the path to the hall itself. Lewis also points out an interesting paradox. You can't even conclude from his silence whether he thinks those disputed points are important or not.
Why not? Because the significance of the disagreements is itself a disputed point among Christians. Some denominations see a doctrinal disagreement as a matter of eternal life and death. Others see it as a secondary point of practice. So Lewis sidestepped the content of the controversy and the severity of it at the same time.
Lewis also had a second category of strategic omissions, especially with moral issues in Book 3. And this avoidance was rooted in a totally different reason. Personal humility and experience, not evangelistic strategy.
This is a really profound moment of personal transparency in the preface. Lewis references his time as an infantryman in the First World War. He said he developed a great dislike of people who, themselves in ease and safety, issue exhortations to men in the front line.
That experience colored his whole approach to moral guidance. He was reluctant to speak with authority about temptations he didn't personally face, seeing himself as one of those men standing in ease and safety.
And this feeling led him to avoid two specific moral topics. First, permissible gambling. Lewis states the impulse that makes men gamble was left out of my makeup. He lacked the internal experience of that temptation, and so he felt unqualified to give firm public advice to those who struggled with it.
And second, the issue of birth control. Lewis avoided taking a firm public line on this, noting that he was not a woman, nor even a married man, nor am I a priest. He lacked the necessary context, the pastoral office, and the personal exposure to the pains, dangers, and expenses of childbearing and marriage.
The key insight here is that Lewis's humility was practical. He reserved his public moral instruction for areas where he felt he'd earned the right to speak or where the principle was universal and undeniable.
One of the most fascinating takeaways Lewis shared came from the reception of his book and the sort of the disagreement he encountered.
Lewis noted that the hostility to his book, the criticism that it was too vague or too specific, came less from convinced members of communions different from my own, so people firmly in their rooms, and more from borderline people who were not exactly obedient to any communion.
And this observation, Lewis found, was curiously consoling. He actually found hope in the source of the criticism.
His reasoning was that this suggested that at her center, where her truest children dwell, that each communion is really closest to every other in spirit, if not in doctrine. The closer a person gets to the living core faith of any denomination, the deeper they are in the room, the more likely they are to affirm the shared common core Lewis presented. The further you drift from real commitment, the more likely you are to quarrel with the common denominator.
Lewis gives us a timeless lesson in strategic communication and linguistic clarity. If we want words to function effectively, we have to respect their objective definition, refusing to let a term like Christian degrade into a useless synonym for our subjective approval.
And we see the architectural brilliance of that hall and rooms analogy. The core beliefs of mere Christianity are not some weak compromise. They are robust and distinct, separated by a chasm from all non-Christian thought. And yet these common beliefs logically compel the believer toward actual life and worship, which demands commitment and choice within a specific tradition.
Lewis concluded his preface by saying that while his initial goal was just to explain the core faith to outsiders, he may have made it clear why we ought to be reunited. He didn't set out to solve reunion, but he presented the case for why unity is necessary.
What's fascinating here is the sheer commonality of the apostolic witness he identified. If Lewis's work shows that at the center of every communion is someone who, against all divergences of belief, speaks with the same voice, we're left with a vital question. Knowing that our objective definition of Christian is rooted in accepting the apostolic teaching from Acts 11, what active steps should you, the listener, take today to ensure that central voice guides your life and worship, prioritizing that shared message over the secondary disagreements that keep us separated? The hall is open, but the life is in the room. Which door requires your conviction? Think about that as you continue to study.